All right, very good. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled, After Afghanistan, Does the US Need Bases in the Middle East at All? My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move US foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on restraint and diplomacy. President Biden has declared that the withdrawal from Afghanistan puts an end to, quote, an era of major military operations to remake other countries. This statement has added further urgency to the question of what the US's military footprint in the Middle East should be. This is a central question in Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's forthcoming Global Posture Review. But does the United States need to have any permanent military bases in the Middle East at all? Not according to former Pentagon advisor Eugene Golds, who argues in a QI paper titled, Nothing More to Do, Why America Can Bring All Troops Home from the Middle East, that the US's core interests in the region are safe. And as a result, the United States should begin significant withdrawals from the region and eventually close down all permanent bases there. Former NSC Director Kirsten Fontenrose disagrees. And today, in the next hour, they will try to sort out this issue. But before we get started, let me just give a reminder to everyone who's watching us over Zoom that you can ask your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And I will try to get to those questions throughout the conversation. And if you're watching this on Facebook or on YouTube, please put in your questions in the chat and we will try to get to those questions as well. So with no further ado, let's get started. First, we have Eugene Golds, who's a professor of political science at University of Notre Dame. Between 2012 and 2010 and 2012, he served in the Pentagon as senior advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. He's the co-author of two books, Buying Military Transformation, Technological Innovation, and the Defense Industry. And secondly, US Defense Politics, The Origins of Security Policy. Secondly, we have Kirsten Fontenrose, who is the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Kirsten spent 2018 as senior director for the Persian Gulf at the National Security Council, leading the development of US policy towards the GCC, Yemen, Egypt, and Jordan. Prior to this service at the White House, she held positions at the State Department as well as the Pentagon. So, to our discussion. Eugene, you wrote a paper a couple of weeks ago for the Quincy Institute in which you argued that based on the US's interest in the region largely being safe, the United States really does not need to have any military bases in the region at all, and that it would serve US interests to close down the permanent bases and start withdrawing all troops from the region. A couple of years ago, that would have been a really controversial position, perhaps even heresy in Washington. Today, the ground is shifted, perhaps not so far as to argue for the full withdrawal, but nevertheless, recognizing the need for the US to reduce its military footprint in the region. But can you lay out your argument as to why the United States actually does not need any bases at all in the Middle East?
Sure. And, I want to thank you, Trita, for organizing this. Thank the Quincy Institute and thank Kirsten for commenting and discussing. I look forward to what I think will be an interesting conversation. So I should clarify one thing to start, which is the paper I wrote is nothing much to do rather than nothing more to do. It makes a slight difference in the sense that I can imagine there being things that the United States would want to do. It's not that we have nothing more to do. I just think it should be a lot less and that we don't need a lot of military force and military bases to do it. And so what I did in the paper, and closely related to what I believe, not surprisingly, is that I did a military analysis. So I took two US interests in the Middle East as a given. So Trita, you contacted me and said, hey, we would like a military analysis of what it would take for the United States to achieve these goals in the Middle East. And I didn't debate the goals. I think they're, potentially worthy goals. They're justified in a separate Quincy paper, but I took as a given that the goal was to prevent regional hegemony in the Middle East and to preserve important global commerce from the Middle East, which I took to be oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. So that's how I kind of operationalized the goals was, okay, we don't want any country to militarily dominate the Middle East, and we don't want anyone to use military force to disrupt the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And then I did an analysis to try to understand, well, what would it take to actually achieve military hegemony or disrupt the flow of oil? And then given what it would take, what are the kinds of responses that you would make that would kind of tip the balance and make it harder for someone to undermine those American interests? And the answer is, given the current situation in the Middle East, the distribution of power across countries, the geography of the Middle East, it's a large area. A lot of it is pretty exposed territory for military operations. In some places, it gets very channelized by geography, by mountains. If you kind of look carefully at it and you think about what it would take to conduct these operations, they're very, very difficult operations for the offense, for a country that's trying to threaten American interests. And given the difficulty, I started to think about, well, if no one can achieve the threats to the American interest, how much do we need to do to stop something that no one could do anyway? And I thought, well, there are a couple of limited areas where, we could do something that could make it a little harder for the already hard mission. Like, we shouldn't imagine that potential adversaries in the Middle East are 10 feet tall and just awesome. We should think about their real practical constraints and challenges. And then if we want to make it a little harder for them, well, what would we have to do? And it doesn't involve US troop deployments and US bases. So basically, very quickly, I identified, other than balance of power and geography, which are the starters that kind of tell me there are roughly 4 countries that you could imagine making a bid for hegemony. And there's only 1 country you could imagine making a bid to disrupt the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. What would it take for one of those 4 or for that one to succeed? And I say there are 5 things that a bid for regional hegemony requires. And some countries have some of them, but no country has all of them. So just quickly, the list: they have to be militarily good at maintenance and logistics. So they have to be able to just drive and operate over vast distances away from their homelands, right? So this is basic. No one's even fighting them yet, but they're struggling. The second thing that you have to have is the ability to have a mobile air defense, so that your military, a good mobile air defense, so that your military, when it's moving through the open, is not exposed to the withering modern capability for even not that good air forces to destroy targets on the ground. Precision fires that are against exposed moving forces can really blunt an offensive. And so you have to have a good air defense or you're dead in the water. The third thing that you need is the ability for your commanders to adapt to events and take the initiative and make good decisions when you get off script. So you can plan a script and practice and prepare a very limited offensive. But given the distances and given the amount of time it takes to really conquer a lot of territory, you're going to get off script. And the question is, can your military forces operate when they're off script? Because they're going to have to. The fourth thing is, just in a ground combat environment, the modern system of ground combat is very complex, requires high-end training and the ability to combine many different kinds of operational military equipment in just the right kind of complex ballet that you can use covering concealment and suppressive fire and survive on the battlefield. And if you don't do this, your forces collapse very quickly. And it's very hard, especially on the offense. And then the fifth thing is, if you want to make a bid for hegemony, you need to be able to, if you're one of the countries in the Middle East and you want to make a bid for hegemony, you don't have enough raw power to just beat everybody. So you have to be able to accumulate power. So each first set of conquest has to contribute to your power so you can make the second conquest. And so that means you need to be able to occupy and draw resources from the areas that you conquer during your bid for hegemony. And that is not a realistic prospect for many countries. So that's the conquest. It's just very difficult for anyone just left to their own devices to pull off the conquest. Very briefly on the disrupting flows through the oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz side, look, it's fairly easy to get off one damaging shot, to damage one oil tanker for a brief period of time before it gets repaired, to kind of, put a mine on the side of a ship and blow it up and it doesn't sink the ship, it just does some damage and you have to repair it and it's a little disruptive and it gets a headline. But the reality of the amount of oil that flows through the strait is millions of barrels per day, every day. And if you wanted to do a strategically significant disruption, if you wanted to really disrupt the amount of oil getting to global markets, as opposed to just pull off a, kind of a razzle dazzle, one-off temporary, no effect on global prices, you would have to be able to hit and damage significantly, dozens of oil tankers every day for many days in a row. And the kinds of weapons you might use to attack the tankers are not actually well designed for hitting tankers or for damaging tankers. So we have a fair amount of experience of people trying to hit and damage tankers. You can kind of look at this over time. In the 1980s, about 150 tankers were hit by anti-ship missiles. There have been tankers hit by mines, and they don't do that much damage. So in order to pull this off, to really disrupt oil flows, you've got to be able to reliably fire, say, 100 missiles a day, every day, while keeping yourself alive in the face of oil exporters, not the United States, but kind of the mediocre air forces of the Persian Gulf trying to make it hard for you. And it's just not likely that any country could pull this off. And of course, the only country we're really talking about that has tried to buy forces relevant to this is Iran. And if Iran really wanted to pull it off, they need a lot more forces and a lot more capability. And the kinds of things that they've been investing in, they specialize in the razzle dazzle. They specialize in things that look, intimidating when you put together a YouTube video of firing off a volley of test ballistic missiles. They don't specialize in the kind of complex multi-part military operations that it would take to really cause a substantial disruption to the Strait of Hormuz. The last point I'll make is, even if you were really worried about if you think I'm wrong and you think someone could make a bid for hegemony, or you think it is easier to disrupt oil flows than I'm portraying it, you don't need military bases in peacetime in the region to prepare, even if you wanted to intervene against this. Now, I don't think we need to intervene against this, but even if you wanted to, you don't need the military bases there. You could do it from ships. You could do it if you really wanted to, as we did for the Gulf War in 1990, by flowing American air power into a local base if you wanted, at some time in the future. We don't have to pre-commit to any of this. And so I think we could just pull back. Thank you. I took a little more than 5 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Kirsten, you served in the Trump NSC at a moment where there were, I guess one can say, confusing signals. On the one hand, beginning to withdraw from Afghanistan, at the same time moving much closer to Saudi Arabia and some of the GCC states, yet at the same time not going to war with Iran on their behalf after the attacks against Saudi oil fields, etc. What is your take and what is your immediate response to Eugene's argument?
Thanks very much, Eugene. Thanks for the thought-provoking paper and for introducing it here. And Shrita, thanks for the introduction and to the Quincy Institute for hosting this. I think it's going to be a really worthwhile discussion. It's already fun. To keep us in a parallel structure and format, I'll start with 2 enduring U.S. interests in the Middle East and 2 objectives necessary to achieve them, as Eugene did, and then discuss a bit. And then we can build on those. These intentionally overlap significantly with what Eugene mentioned, so we can have a good discussion, but the nuanced differences will probably highlight a fundamental difference in our interpretation. So as I see it, the US interests are ensuring that the US is the preferred partner of regional states with the privileges this entails politically and militarily. And two, ensuring that energy and commerce flow unimpeded to locations that positively impact American prosperity. And the objectives are to prevent the conditions by which America's adversaries, state and non-state, can unduly influence the strategic choices of partners in the Middle East. And second, to disrupt terrorist threats to Americans and US partners. So I think the foundational problem with the opposition to US basing in the Middle East is that it assumes our relationships with the host country and those of our adversaries freeze in place when we depart. And unfortunately, this is not the case. In fact, an exit from the region will catalyze a paradigm shift that will stymie US interests without any military activity at all. Assuming we can secure our interests and achieve our objectives without forward bases also assumes that partners hosting these bases share our assessment of threats to them. But China, Russia, or Iran will not have to become a singular regional hegemon to thwart our interests, and they will not have to coordinate to do it. I would just cede to Eugene that I agree that the other three probably aren't even posing an issue. My concern is an extra-regional hegemon. So the combined efforts of these three, again, not coordinated, but combined, based only on behaviors we have already seen them display in the Middle East, will mean that no country by itself will have to fight its way to regional hegemony in order to obstruct America's interests, because our partners will not wait to see if Iran or Turkey or Saudi come across their borders. They'll make the decisions long before that. And these decisions will be intended to keep them safe, but they'll undermine US interests. Net, net, we lose. The majority of our bases fulfill training and maintenance missions, not combat missions in the Middle East. And these missions ensure that regional militaries devise strategies aligned with the US and that they maintain materiel that allows the US to come in and plug and play when need be. Because of shifting and aggressive policies towards the US from Russia and China that invalidate some of our assumptions about their objectives, we don't know when that need will be. And as Admiral McCraven said at the Aspen Security Forum once, you can't search trust. We've all heard that repeated. You certainly can't sign an MOU for access to trust. And I think our interest in ensuring that the US is the preferred partner of regional states with the privileges I mentioned this entails politically and militarily is not solely about preventing the rise of a regional hegemon. It's about preventing extra regional hegemons from making the Middle East a second home to their hegemony. So our withdrawal would knock down the first domino. And this is how I see the paradigm shift going. One, a US exit from the region emboldens state or non-state actors to increase demands of, or proposals to, or aggressions toward our friends. We don't have a diplomatic bench trained and resourced to fill the day-to-day engagement space that our military would then leave open. So adversarial demands of, proposals to, and aggressions toward our friends would freely hit their marks. We can talk a bit about the role of diplomacy later on, perhaps. After that, our friends perceive a heightened need for self-defense in the absence of a US presence they believe was a deterrent against their emboldened adversaries, and they're open to offers from China or Russia for arms sales, basing and regional security architecture, and to unfavorable deals from Iran. They would still prefer a US partner, but they feel that that option no longer remains open in real terms. Then as Russia and or Chinese proposals are accepted, their influence on national strategies in the region increases. And now they hold some of the levers of foreign policy in our friends' countries. Using these levers, they control 2 to 3 of the globe's 8 crucial choke points for the flow of energy and commerce without firing a shot. Chinese domination of choke points in the Middle East would undoubtedly be used to advance Beijing's mercantilist approach rather than guaranteeing freedom of navigation for others. And as I see it from the seat of increased regional leverage, they can also deny the US access to conduct CT operations from our friends' territory unless the operation supports their own CT objectives, crippling our ability to conduct over-the-horizon CT missions against groups that pose a threat to our homeland unless they also pose a threat to the extra-regional hegemon influencing the decision. Further, military exercises and arms sales with the US are curtailed, interoperability is reduced to useless, and the Middle East is no longer a region where the US can come forward and plug and play when need be. The net result of this paradigm shift caused by the US withdrawal is that US interests are fully undermined, US objectives are fully thwarted. I'll stop there for now. so we can talk.
Very good. Thank you so much, Chris. That's quite a lot to react to, and I'm going to give it to you, Eugene. But if I could ask you to perhaps focus or at least address two of the core points that is raised by Kirsten. First of all, that the situation is not static and that there would be this cascade of events that would fundamentally change, as Kirsten would put it, the paradigm, and as a result, the previous analysis doesn't hold. And the other aspect is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Kirsten, but I think there is quite a lot of language that you put forward that perhaps erases a bit the boundary between what is U.S. interest and what is the interest of some of the U.S.'s partners. And to the best of my knowledge, and I'll let Eugene speak for himself here, that the analysis he has put forward is for the protection of U.S. interests and not necessarily those of other states. But if you could address these points or many other points that Kirsten raised, particularly whether the Chinese actually have an intention of doing this or not, would be quite helpful.
Sure, great, and thank you, Kirsten. Very, very interesting comments and an interesting scenario you spin together there. So, I mean, I think you're right. We do just have a kind of a difference in core approach. So the first thing is I actually disagree with you. I don't think I'm imagining static politics and diplomacy in the Middle East at all. I just am envisioning a very different adjustment or a very different dynamic than the one that you're thinking of. So, right now, you talk about all of our friends in the Middle East. Well, our friends are a mixed set of friends, right? They have, there are some things that we like about them and some things we don't like about them. And, there are some costs to being closely associated with them. And those friends, have interests that are indeed different than ours. And often, given our friendship, they seek to manipulate us to seek right now to promote their ends rather than our ends, thinking about what our strategy. So, you and I may disagree about whether it's an important interest of the United States to fight a war with Iran anytime soon, but some of our friends are much more eager to have us do that than I think the United States is. And right now, our relationship, I would like to change that dynamic where they are pushing us to do something we otherwise wouldn't do. I think it's also true that the day-to-day presence of the United States in the region, and I'm not a scholar of comparative politics of the region, but my understanding from talking to comparative politics scholars or from reading mainstream publications, the people of the region basically believe that the United States is the puppet master of all kinds of things that happen there. Like if something bad happens, they think it's because we wanted it to happen. We get blamed for a lot of stuff that we probably didn't really cause or we don't really care about. But the up close and personal US presence exposes us to the animosity and to the blame and to the hatred of many locals that I would just like to get out of. And I expect that to change if the United States leaves the bases. And so I think there's a very different dynamic of changing hostility in the region, I'm most concerned about changing hostility to the United States. Trita wrote a really interesting piece this week, actually, about changing hostility among the locals, right? They may choose not to fight. They may see, hey, if we can't get the United States to back us in some aggressive effort, we're not going to be able to win. And so we can come to some kind of a peaceful accommodation to learn to live in the Middle East through diplomacy. I'll leave that up to Trita, but it sounds like normal, responsible balance of power behavior that doesn't affect core US interests. Now, the other key question, so I don't think we're static. The other key question is this an opening for, in particular, you mentioned China, but it could be China or Russia, some extra regional power. And I don't think that's the case. Now, I think, kind of diplomatically, is it likely that if we started to phase out, the Chinese would seek to, criticize or say, look, they're not reliable, that they would make a PR push the way they have with respect to Afghanistan? I'm sure that's the case. But whether it's makes any difference in a kind of a real diplomacy or real balance of power sense is not at all clear to me. So I just don't think any country would find it in their interest to have, the kinds of things that would threaten the United States happen. So major Chinese bases, thousands of Chinese troops in the region, the equivalent of what we have had in the region, let alone what it would require China to try to bid for regional hegemony or to cow other countries into giving up their independence, right? So hegemony is not just, China gets their diplomatic phone calls answered. Well, I would assume that China ought to get their diplomatic phone calls answered. The question is whether any country wants to give up their independence, autonomy, and sovereignty and learn to speak Mandarin. And I can't imagine that there are any countries in the Middle East that have that on their range of acceptable objectives. And so I just don't think this cascade you're talking about is plausible.
Kirsten, your turn.
Yeah, thanks. I'll respond one at a time. Just on that last point, about speaking Mandarin, I would point out that most of the region does in fact speak English now in many ways, and that it hasn't been an aggressive directive that has made that happen. It's simply been the region seeing that as being where their bread and butter has been, their bread has been best buttered. And I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen another way. But let me go in the order of your points. With regard to your comment about the people of the region thinking the US is a puppet master, I would agree with you in a great part on that. But I don't think the US has to be present for that conspiracy theory to continue existing. It did before. I believe it will, regardless of whether we're there or not. In fact, they'll just say that we're using all kinds of more nefarious tools for doing it. And then I would point out that the populations in the countries where we do have US bases are less anti-American than in other countries. So in places around in Kuwait and Oman and Qatar and Saudi and the UAE and Jordan, we have more pro-American populations than we do in countries where we do not have a US base with which the locals interact regularly. Let's talk a little bit about the region kind of finding its own answers, because this is something I'm really hopeful for. But unfortunately, I think that we all may be using a little bit of wishful thinking here. I think when we look to something like the Baghdad Summit that happened recently, America's Arab partners attended this summit primarily for the purpose of supporting Iraqi Prime Minister al-Khatami in his position just before they have elections on October 10th. So it was precisely because they think he is the one thing preventing the Iranian-leaning members of parliament from pushing for a vote that would require the prime minister to evict the US. So they're there to send a sign to the Iraqi public that they support Iraq as an Arab state and do not support Iranian intervention. So they're trying to prevent that hegemonic move by Iran. I would point you toward the speech that President Sisi gave at that Baghdad summit, where he repeatedly talks about the Arabism of Iraq and the role of Iraq in the Arab world when he addresses the population there. I also wouldn't put too much stock in the meetings between Riyadh and Tehran. There's obviously grave mistrust that quite a bit about, but the requests from the Iranian side are predictably steeper than Saudi can realistically agree to. And in my opinion, this is Iran's favorite way to negotiate. They come to the table, they get points for negotiating without ever having an intention of reaching a real deal. But unfortunately, Iran holds most of the cards in these talks because Saudi needs attacks on its homeland to end, and Saudi isn't actively directing attacks against the Iranian homeland. So what this means is that Saudi is in the difficult kind of position that I talked about that makes it vulnerable to proposals from our adversaries. For example, like if Russia agreed to a new UN Security Council resolution blocking arms transfers to the Houthis in exchange for Saudi paving the way for Syria to re-enter the Arab League and funding reconstruction and regime-controlled parts of Syria, if Saudi believes the US is pulling out militarily from the region entirely, then no logical person, I don't think, could expect Saudi to say no to that, and that inherently undermines our interests. In terms of the question about whether Russia or China have the means or the intent of being regional hegemons, I think that the idea that they would not be viable challengers to US interests in the Middle East are based on pre-Putin and pre-Xi assumptions about the long-term goals of Russia and China. We were not prepared for Xi's antagonistic policies aimed at displacing us globally, and these policies have forced us to change our own over the past 8 years he's been in the seat. And I think assuming that China has no sights on usurping our influence in the Middle East underestimates what we're seeing in terms of their diplomatic efforts and their information campaigns that are aimed at turning the populations and not just the governments against a preference for the US. And Kuwaitis talk about this all the time. So we're already seeing those who oppose our interests focused on projecting power in the region, and those who support our interests feeling it necessary to make bargains with these expanding powers. And that's not just a theory. I mean, the groundwork for this paradigm shift is already laid based on just the expectation that the US will withdraw. For example, we're seeing Chinese advisors embedded in the MOD in Saudi Arabia. We're seeing again in Saudi that China is assisting them with the development of civilian nuclear technologies, even though we oppose that. And if the full withdrawal were to occur, I think this dynamic would accelerate. I don't think we can assume that China's trade-focused approach today would remain static. It changed drastically when she came to power. It could change further. I would just add that, one note that China is courting Pakistan with requests for basing Chinese military there. And Karachi is only about 540 miles from Muscat. Arguments, I think, that China is solely intent on being a hegemon in its neighborhood, apparently think that China's neighborhood is only to its east. I think both Russia and Iran have floated proposals for regional security architecture in which the US is absent. And in Russia's case, where Russia replaces the US as a hub, China has also floated a proposal to the GCC for a regional security mechanism that would have them at the center. The region hasn't taken the bait from Russia yet, and the GCC hasn't replied to China yet. But this is something we can't leave to chance. And our footprint is the primary reason the region has not considered these offers seriously. In terms of the intended pivot to Asia during much of the DC debate, I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan required bringing the US only naval carrier in Asia to the Middle East for 3 months. And what kind of strategic vulnerabilities would it create in the South China Sea in terms of China's spreading hegemonistic, I try to make up a word there, ambitions? If we withdrew from everywhere in the Middle East, doing it over a 5 to 10 year timeline as proposed would really only help China conveniently schedule their plans to exploit those vulnerabilities.
Look, Eugene, before you go in, can I, because I want to get in some questions from the audience as well, but also combine one thing that you mentioned earlier on, Kirsten. First of all, we have a brief that was published this week by David Devine. The United States has 750 roughly bases around the world. The Chinese, according to my last count, as 1 or 2. So, there's quite a lot of catching up if we're arguing that they're trying to establish hegemony. But much of what you said, Kirsten, isn't that actually in the diplomatic realm, in the sense that, yes, they're absolutely trying to increase their influence, and they're doing so through diplomatic means. And as you mentioned earlier on, we don't have the diplomatic bench, perhaps because we have focused so much on the military side. So if we want to make sure that they are not usurping us influence-wise in the Middle East, shouldn't we be investing more in the diplomacy rather than thinking that our influence comes through the barrel of a gun?
Is that for me or we?
Yeah, it's for you, Kirsten.
Okay, yes, I completely agree with you that we need to invest more in diplomacy, 100%. We do not have, as I mentioned before, a diplomatic bench that's trained or resourced to fill the gap that our military would leave in terms of the day-to-day interactions with these countries in the Middle East if we were to withdraw wholesale. And that, as I mentioned, would make the friends or partners or somewhat friends, as Eugene points out, they're open to the demands or proposals of our adversaries. But the military is currently our most widespread and consistent tool of engagement with the Middle East, even in non-conflict states. And we can't relinquish our largest diplomatic effort until we have a diplomatic corps that is ready to pick up the slack. We have not trained them for the task that they would have. Most FSOs, if they haven't served at the NSC, have never even been read into intelligence on how US adversaries and enemies operate. And if we pull our military before we have a State Department ramped up and tooled for the job, we'll create an influence vacuum that competing hegemons are already working to fill. And I think this would be the equivalent of why we haven't clenched definitive victories in places we've entered militarily, like Iraq and Afghanistan. We're great at capture kill by DoD. We're great at long-term institution building by USAID and state, but we're not good, or we entirely skip that piece in the middle because it hints of colonization, and we recoil from that. And that's the space where, between the defeat of enemy and between the functioning state, when power struggles turn into civil wars, where kleptocrats argue that they should be leaders, where VEOs grab power, where deals are made by our adversaries with local power brokers that exploit and undermine, exploit them and undermine our interests. And since we're not currently tooled and resourced for that, and neither is the international community, we can't prop up a country that is just, molted before its shell hardens. Yes, I just use a soft shell crab analogy for geopolitics. Let's work that into doctrine. But pulling our military bases before we have a new strategy for the Middle East and before we have a ready diplomatic corps, as you correctly point out, and other tools in place to implement it, will create some stage of vulnerability, that same stage, in our partners and make them prone to proposals from our competitors. So I agree that we need to build it. I just don't think you can pull before you have it built.
Eugene, you want to react to that and other things that Kirsten said? And also, there's a question to you from the audience from Greg Pretty, who asks, agrees with your argument regarding excessive U.S. presence, but post 2019 UPIC attack at the Saudi oil field, isn't the larger threat to oil and LNG unique infrastructure and plentiful and cheap cruise missiles? Does that not change your military analysis?
Well, so Greg, that's a good question. Greg and I have known each other for a long time. Thank you for that. So, I mean, Kirsten, most of your comments, I could talk to you about strategy. I have views about strategy. I've been writing about this for a long time, but it's, kind of not what I'm here to talk about today. I did a military analysis for Quincy, and, we could talk about the tea leaves and whether the tea leaves are important in trying to predict what China wants and what China will do, and the ups and downs of individual countries. One thing I would just say is, it's bad for our diplomacy that we've made combatant commanders who have no diplomatic background. I mean, they're of course good at military politics. That's how they got to be combatant commanders, but we've made them our viceroys for regions. And, yours is a recipe for that never changing, right? Because as long as the military is there, the locals would prefer to interact with the regional viceroy who actually has a lot of money and power, as opposed to interacting with the State Department. So, I mean, I'd say, let's do what Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton suggested that we do, which is, cut a bunch from the Defense Department tomorrow and give it to state and start build, whatever. But your recipe that says, well, we can't do anything to change the military presence until we do this tremendous change in the State Department, is a recipe for never changing anything with respect to the American military. And that just doesn't seem like a good choice. But to answer Greg's question about threats to oil flows, I agree with you, Greg, that there are other threats besides the threat to shipping. I also I think those other threats can also easily be exaggerated. I took the strategic aims in my military analysis as a given, which said, pay attention to threats to commerce, not threats to production. I guess, the core message would be, if I could just get the world to stop talking about the threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz and to talk and actually do analysis and start to have a discussion of the scenarios that you're talking about, which have to do with, specialized infrastructure, I think that would be a ton of progress, right? Like, we would be ratcheting down the tension and ratcheting down our understanding of the need for a militarized American presence, because we would be checking off one of the supposed big interests and say, look, we don't have to do anything to address that interest. Now, I think the attack on Abqaiq in 2019, you can interpret it lots of different ways of what it shows about the ability to damage fixed infrastructure. It was a pretty big attack, lots of missiles involved, precision hits, and not defended against particularly, right? There was not a lot of effort to prevent it at the time. It came as kind of a surprise. And the result was 0 barrels of oil disrupted from consumers, right? So the Saudis had enough inventory to keep making their exports despite the attack. And the rest of the world didn't even have to flex its barrels of inventory to make it up. And the race between damage and repair, it was hard to cause sufficient damage and prevent repairs to actually disrupt the oil market. And that's ultimately the analysis you would have to do. Can a couple of quite small cruise missile or drone attacks sort of plinking cause enough damage or enough persistent damage to keep the oil flow shut down in the face of natural Saudi, or we could say Emirati, or whatever other country you're talking about getting attacked? They have a huge incentive to maintain their exports by continuing to repair, by pre-positioning repair stocks, by managing inventories, a whole bunch of things that prevent disruption of the global market. Like, again, this is a very challenging mission to actually disrupt the global market. And even what was perceived in some ways as a home run attack had no effect. And I think that's the takeaway.
Thank you so much, Eugene. And Kirsten, I want to go back to you, but I want to bring in 2 other questions from the audience that you also can react to, Kirsten. One is from Faye Moqtader, who asked, what about if the JCPOA is not resurrected? Does that change the military analysis in the sense that if the Iranian nuclear program ends up becoming unrestricted, can that change your analysis? But also, if you want to comment on the political angle of it, whether it changes the military analysis or not, will it make any potential withdrawal much more difficult? And then there's also a question that I think Kirsten did address, and that is, what about counterterrorism? Will a withdrawal of these permanent bases make it much more difficult for the United States to be able to conduct counterterrorism operations? I think Kirsten argued that it would make it more difficult, that the over-horizon type of things would no longer work because of the cascading of events that she is laying out, saying that many of these countries would start shifting elsewhere. Can you comment on that? And then I'm going to go back to Kirsten.
Okay, so you wanted me to comment.
You did, yeah.
So on counterterrorism, so again, there are lots of complex moving pieces in all of these things, right? And so I think one issue is the political calculation that much terrorism, or much of what we call terrorism, right? You could debate the definitions of terrorism, is attacks on locals or attacks on US forces deployed to the region, which might not fit the definition of the technical definition of terrorism. But those, all of the people who are motivated by local politics would no longer implicate the United States one way or another if we pulled back. We would be less exposed to their attacks, and they would have less incentive to target us if we weren't up there in their face, controlling, looking like a big target, looking like we are controlling their politics of their local region, and looking like occupiers from their perspective, even if that's not our self-perception or our intent. Other people, we just want to make it harder for people to get the wrong idea about the United States. And our current presence makes it easy for them to get the wrong idea about us. And sure, some of them will still get the wrong idea anyway, as Kirsten said, but fewer of them. And those who get the wrong idea, it'll be less intense because we're not there, bringing our people, culture, whatever, or the different things that rub them the wrong way, seeming to support autocratic governments or apostate governments that they don't like, or whatever it might be. So, there's a motivation issue. And then with respect to capability, I don't think we would give up as much as Kirsten does. As she points out, lots of the bases are kind of maintenance bases or training bases that don't have much to do with gathering intelligence or with offensive military operations. So we're really talking about a few places that are intelligence gathering centers. And, if we wanted, we could have intel cooperation with some of these countries. I'd sort of prefer less rather than more, because the more cooperation we have, or carefully modulated, because when we have lots of intense intel cooperation with these countries, the locals get the idea that we're backing the secret police that they hate. Right. And so it's the political dynamic that makes a big difference. And the question is, how much sensible, actionable intel that is related to counterterrorism against the United States do we get, versus how much of a problem do we create by identifying with, kind of the thuggish aspects of some of these regimes, or highlighting our, involvement in complex local politics that we don't understand that well, and that leads the locals to manipulate us, right? So basically, I think our counterterrorism, there are conflicting things, but on net, I think we'd be better off, not worse off, from both a capabilities and an intention standpoint if we were to pull back. And I do think that's an important conversation to have. And I would point out, you could think about, if you wanted to do a different kind of analysis, what is the optimal military posture to support counterterrorism, which is not our current posture. And it's also not the posture, it's not the core US interest that I was addressing in my paper. But I don't think it would look anything like the current US base infrastructure. Like, no one would dream this up as, hey, this is the best way to do counterterrorism in the Middle East.
Thanks, Eugene. Kirsten, you want to come in on that?
Sure. I just want to make sure that we're differentiating here between Title 10, Title 22, and Title 50, because I think in the discussion about the public's animosity toward the US presence because it is seen as enabling oppressive local forces. I agree with that. But I think in many cases, those forces are Title 22 forces, which would not necessarily be impacted whatsoever by the withdrawal of US military. Also, CT operations often fall within Title 50. So Title 10, you're really talking about active combat and other things, and maintenance and logistics and the training missions, some of the training missions. Not all of them, some of them are 22. So we kind of have to look at, all right, if we pull back from bases, if we pull DOD research, pull Title 10 back from these bases, then will that actively change the perception that the public has of the US relationship with their governments? Very likely not, because as we all know, unfortunately, it's a truism. The theory that we support the negative things that local governments do will be in place unless we do things actively to ostracize those governments from us in public realms like the UN. Otherwise it will be assumed that we are behind the scenes and we're pulling the strings. And if we can maintain Title 22, training of law enforcement and the like, then we still won't escape from that perception, even if we do pull back DOD bases. And I do think that if we need we need the white soft presence, we need the training presence there because it's critical to our CT operations, to the black soft. We need the relationships that we build through white soft to gain approval to conduct black soft inside other nations' territory. And those are necessary, those are built through the ongoing interaction, not the drop in with your guys, your door kickers and get out. You need to be constantly paving that way and keeping that trust built so that those operations are permitted. I think, and find fix operations require months of data gathering on the ground about the target's patterns of life, because you need to know when to take a strike that will limit civilian casualties. And if you're flying in from somewhere else, if you're flying in from the Gulf to Afghanistan, for instance, several hours, 6 to 8 hours in the plane and then 5 hours over target, it's very difficult to keep the eyes on the ground about a growing terrorist threat and take action against it. I would also say, going back to the issue of Russia-China on the CT piece, the campaigns that they're running focused on the publics of the Middle East right now, seeking to deny us access to their decision makers and deny us kind of the hearts and minds of their publics, would likely also be used to deny us access to conduct CT operations, unless that operation, as I mentioned, is in their specific interest. Even if it's likely to reinstate US in any way, even if it is aligned with their interests, they'd probably also then be likely to block it. And I think this denial becomes much easier when we're not there. It's easier to simply deny access for an operation than it is to kick out a military that lives in country and employs local workers and works with you every day. So I do see a withdrawal making CT over the horizon operations even more difficult.
So, Kirsten, basically, you just see a much more activist. Like, you think it's a good thing for the United States to be regularly killing and grabbing people in other countries. That's fine. That's a very aggressive position about the United States. It is kind of what we do now. But I think it's actually, just the rhythm of the frequency with which we would have to do counterterrorism operations would be dramatically less, or should be dramatically less no matter what, but especially if we pulled back US forces. An advantage of that is that, we're not doing multiple strikes a month just because we can, because, we would have a more differentiated and careful approach to how often we kill people in other countries. And you're right, local governments approve in many cases, not all, like the Yemen government, whatever, such as it is not, approving our strikes. But, some local governments approve our killing their domestic political enemies. In fact, they feed us the information that leads us to kill the locals. They might tell us, oh, you should get this person, he really hates America, when their real motive, we don't know. It's just like, do we trust these people to tell us who to kill? I basically would like to trust them a lot less to tell us who to kill. And killing fewer people in other countries might redound to the benefit of the United States in terms of prestige and diplomacy, and potentially impetus for anti-American terrorism. And I mean, you're right. Like, you can have the view that, if we kill a lot of people, we screw up sometimes, but eventually we'll kill enough people that they can't effectively come for us. Or you could have a different view, but that is the status quo view, which is just do a lot of killing and hope for the best. And come up with creative names for how you decide who's a militant or who's a terrorist or how you brand people. And I think we should stop doing that.
There are actually really, really stringent guidelines for how we do decide who we're allowed to take kinetic action.
Any military-aged male who was killed in a drone strike, this is Afghanistan, right? But any militarily-aged male who was killed in a drone strike counted as a combatant, right? This is and you could drive this is the public, right? I understand in private, we're trying to be more careful, but our public justification for who we say is an okay target is so broad you can drive a truck through it. It's not.
Well, you're speaking specifically of Afghanistan. We do have specific AUMF authorities only for Afghanistan. And it was an active conflict of war where the military was in the lead, was the primary tool of national power in,
your view,
Kirsten, that's not the case in places where we have bases.
Locals to make very fine distinctions about American law and American intent, right? So I think the way locals view America is often hostile, but is driven primarily by the most visible things. And the most visible things are not the secret contacts that might be under non-military titles of American law. What they think, even if that's what's really causing the effects they don't like, the first thing that they think about, bad thing happened, and look, there are thousands of American soldiers who look really scary because they drive around in large armored vehicles and they shoot people. I'll put two and two together, maybe incorrectly, but they have they don't see everything that you see from the inside of the NSC. And their view is deeply influenced by the American military presence that makes them hostile.
I agree with you that presence does impact that, and that military-age males who are hit, their families, for instance, would definitely draw a direct line to the US presence. But I don't think that America can make calculations about national security in a place where perhaps we are very concerned about impending threats from a violent organization that is reconstituting itself and plotting actively to attack Americans because we're worried about what a person in that town might think.
Again, we're straying an awful lot into the politics of terrorism, which is kind of not supposed to be our topic today. I mean, it's interesting that, these are all important topics to discuss and important topics where I think we have real disagreements, but, in a way, I find it not surprising that we're not engaging on the core question of what is the US military presence needed to achieve these military objectives, because, you're just writing that off. We don't need the military presence in the Middle East. There's something about politics and diplomacy and and terrorism, this other thing where you can sort of grasp at, yes, we need to still be engaged. But
we're cutting close to the end. Let me ask you, Kirsten, a question. When you take a look at the track record of the time period that the United States has had a very dominant position militarily in the Middle East, in 1998, the region suffered from 5 military conflicts. By 2020, or 2019, that was up to 22 military conflicts. Obviously, these are not all the fault of the United States, although many of them are a direct consequence of the invasion of Iraq, which is entirely the fault of the United States. So, the track record doesn't seem to be particularly good when it comes to the objective of stabilizing the region, because it's not been stable, it's become less and less stable. At the same time, we had the CT conversation, which is oftentimes used to justify being there. But at the same time, we have plenty of data that shows that the more people we kill, because we inevitably kill a lot of innocent people, including just, 2 weeks now, 7 children, 6 from the same family, turn out that it was an American aid worker, not an ISIS terrorist, that we actually create more terrorists than we actually take off of the battlefield. That leaves us in a situation in which, the last justifying reasons put forward for a US military presence in the region is that chaos would ensue if we weren't there. But, and you dismissed what happened in Baghdad, I think, but I want to see if you could address this. Baghdad is happening after several months of several incidents in which many of these countries have increasingly come to the conclusion that the US is leading. And we saw that after the attack against Saudi Arabia and oil fields, that Trump didn't use military force, that suddenly both the UAE and the Saudis started through the Iraqis their diplomacy with the Iranians. And that is now elevated to a point in which We had the summit, and in the summit, you had the French President Macron, who I suspect was not there because he was trying to help Kadhimi win re-election. Are you saying that all of this is just to help Kadhimi domestic politics, and it's not because at the end of the day, without the US there, everyone's calculation changes, and diplomacy, perhaps not successful, but nevertheless becomes an option that is more attractive because some countries no longer can hide between US military power?
Sure. Let me start with just the comment you made about Afghanistan. And I would agree with you that drone strike is exactly an indication of why CT operations from over the horizon are nearly impossible. You have to be there on the ground to be able to do that with any kind of accuracy. And then I would say to your comment about conflicts rising in the last 20 years, absolutely. But I don't think there's any data that shows a correlation between US basing and the rise in conflicts in the region. There are many, many reasons for the rise of those conflicts. And yes, the US is definitely a part of those causes in many, many cases. But I don't think basing is tied to them any way that I've heard or that I've read. With regard to the Baghdad Summit, unfortunately, yes, I would argue that it was solely for domestic purposes in the region. It was solely for propping up al-Kadhimi before the October election in the parliament, to make sure that the Iraqi population understands that he has the support of Arab leaders and Arab countries that surround them. They are actively concerned about an over interference by Iran inside Iraqi politics. As we all know, nothing new there. And this was seen as a way that the leaders could show that they support Iraq if Iraq is part of the Arab fold. And again, I'll point you to the speeches the leaders make that really, really drive this home. And that it's the reason that France was there was also because France was hoping for more movement, bringing Arab nations in Iran, bringing the US and Iran together, because France has its own interests in resolving the blockade of Iran. No judgment there at all. Completely understandable why Macron would have attended. Completely understandable why the Arab heads of state would have attended. But no, I do not think it accomplished anything more than that. I mean, France got a Total contract, which is a great win for them, but otherwise nothing else was achieved. And that's not a condemnation at all, because often these things are just, they're setting a scene or they're kicking off a process. But the real reason behind these from most of the countries in the region was to make sure they sent that signal to Iran that they are claiming Iraq for the Arab fold, and to send a signal to the population of Iraq that they have support of the region if they oppose too much Iranian intervention in their politics.
Thank you for that, Kirsten. I think you and I should debate that at a different seminar, because I'm not as convinced that there is that degree of obsession with Iran. I think that's actually more of a Washington phenomenon than a regional phenomenon. Not to say that there's not a lot of focus on Iran. Without a doubt, there is. But I'm going to give the last word to Eugene to just make some final comments. And then, unfortunately, we have to close.
Well, I mean, final comment. I think this was an interesting conversation, and I think we kind of moved things, forward in some useful ways. I mean, I think it has to be a continuing conversation over time, and I look forward to the next round, the next analysis that spurs it, whatever that might be. Obviously there are some core differences in view about what the goals ought to be, about what the threats to those goals are, and about the intentions and actions of many countries, the Middle Eastern countries and others, right? There's lots of room for discussion and disagreement and hopefully productive conversation. The core thing I'd like to say, that I want people to take away from this is that I would say 90% of the discussion and the difference of views have to do with politics and diplomacy, not military capabilities. And again, I think it's a huge win if we can take this idea that there are major military threats that we need to use the military tool to respond to off the table in our conversations about US foreign policy towards the Middle East. I think we can all agree there are not major military threats, and the US military is not a good response to them. And then we can talk about what's the best mechanism. Probably smarter people than me or people with more diplomatic training than I can have the conversation about what's the best way to use diplomatic means to pay attention to whatever kinds of interests and influence we may actually have that are threatened. So that to me is the takeaway. Thank you, Trita, for putting this together.
Thank you so much, Eugene, and thank you, Kirsten, and thank you all who have been watching this from home or from your offices. We are coming to the end of the program, but before I let you all go, I want to ask you for two small favors. First, go to Quincy's website, quincyinst.org, sign up for our newsletter so that you will get notifications of all our future panels, as well as reports such as the one that Eugene wrote and other products. Secondly, our next webinar is going to be held on October 4th, and its title has Making Wars More Humane, help make them endless. This will be a seminar with a non-resident fellow, Samuel Moyne, Yale professor, who is making that argument in his new book called Humane. And he will be debating that issue with Princeton professor Gary Bass. So with that, I want to thank you all for participating and contributing your questions to this discussion. And I hope to see you all on October 4th. Thank you.